Hey, this is Dr. Emily Sherning with American Resiliency. So I know everything is on fire right now. In my area, it's been an AQI of around 200 for the last 3 days. I think, though, that like how in 2019, the Australian wildfires, the importance of that story globally paled in comparison to COVID. Unfortunately, I think that these Canadian wildfires are going to pale in comparison to the developing climate story around ocean temperatures. I want to talk about that with you this week. You've probably seen some headlines in the news that the ocean is super weirdly hot right now. Waters in some places, they're up to 14 degrees warmer than usual. That's the sort of difference that if you put your hand in 2 pails of water, you would feel an immediate, serious temperature difference. NOAA thinks it's very likely that these conditions are going to persist into the fall, more than 90% likely. So, what does that mean? We've talked on the channel before that we're looking at an El Nino summer in 2023. All the projections are indicating that a very strong El Nino system is coming together. And to give that a little perspective, we've only had 2 strong El Nino events in the last 100 years. Those were in the 97 and 2015. This event is going to be very difficult. It's anticipated to be substantially stronger than those systems. The 2015 that plunged about 60 million people into hunger and malnutrition. These systems have very serious impacts on crop production globally. The current forming El Nino system is likely to peak this autumn and wane in the beginning of 2024. But when you hear El Nino, it kind of is difficult to say what that's going to mean, right? Because it's complex system effect. Let's look at the global outcomes of a typical El Nino event. Just to share an article that I admire in case you want to read some like harder science writing. This piece by Bob Henson this week is lovely. And I'm going to be using some figures from NOAA that he uses in this piece on the Yale Climate Lab. If you want to check out this figure here, this shows sort of global trend impacts. Focusing on the US first, we'll talk about sort of supply chain stuff in a few minutes. I think that it's worth noting that in the US, you anticipate primarily a wet, mild winter in the southern US from El Nino, which, like, that doesn't sound so bad, right? But we're talking about system effects, and there's a lot of variation in what you can get with these very strong El Ninos. I want to show you again from NOAA these precipitation outcomes in the US based on those last 2 very strong El Ninos. We know the West Coast is likely to get hit, but look, it's like an opposite band of who was wet and who was dry the last time this was very strong. So that's really helpful, right, in terms of precipitation trends for the West Coast. There is one place where we see a pretty stable trend these last 2 times. Hopefully, it'll continue, where eastern Nebraska and Kansas got a little bit of extra rain, pretty good rain in eastern Oklahoma. Hopefully, we'll be able to make use of that water in these very important agricultural states. If we want to look at where there's bad news, it looks like there is drought trend consistently the last 2 times as we look into particularly upper Appalachia. So, little concerning there. When we talk about going back to the global outcome, what we're more concerned about globally in terms of world hunger, in terms of world supply chain issues, is this large dry patch over Australasia, over many of these very vulnerable, very densely populated areas, including much of India here, also is going to be facing this drying trend. We do see a lot of concern about this event being expressed in Australia. You may remember in 2019, there was a lot of publicity about the terrible wildfires they were experiencing. Now they've had 3 La Nina years in a row. You may or may not have seen they've had fairly catastrophic urban flooding in a lot of their coastal cities. There's some sentiment in the news that at least they're not going to be dealing with that problem again, but fires are very likely to recur in Australia with this developing system, unfortunately so. And with this El Nino we're moving into, we're looking at record high ocean temps. And when we say record high, we mean by a fair margin. This is a really deviating event. If you're interested in Australasia, if you've been tracking the current heat situation in Southeast Asia, it's been very rough this year. These increasing ocean temperatures, they're a cause for serious concern for people in this large, densely populated, sensitive region. In terms of the supply chain, it's very hard to see how this system won't have an impact on the global supply chain as we get to the end of 23, beginning of 24. And, looking at the global context, seeing the impact on the US in that context, I think it's also useful to look backwards in time because the El Nino phenomena is a global pattern. It's existed for thousands of years. It's a pattern that has messed up human civilizations pretty bad before. It's worth taking seriously. Many scholars think that a hard El Nino cycle contributed to the collapse of the Inca. That was one of the rare empires so fabulous that towards their peak, they gained territory primarily through voluntary mergers, like the EU today. The changes we're seeing in the ocean right now, they're very serious indicators that things are getting hairy. These are ocean temperatures beyond what we'd expect to see in a typical El Nino, or even those we saw in the strong El Ninos in the last 40 years. I want us to take a minute and remember, we've heard this message before, we've talked on the channel before. The changes to the ocean in the next 30 years are projected to be in every way more extreme than the changes to the land. We saw in the updated Alaska video, we expect pretty serious fishery declines around the majority of the US, with broad regional increases in the fisheries of the northern waters. If we look at areas of the US with the projected biggest biodiversity declines, they're around the Gulf coast of Florida, and that's due to the probable impact of these marine heat waves on the life in the ocean there. I wish we didn't have to see these things happening, but this is the time we're alive. So we got to look at reality and do our best. Conditions are going to continue to get worse for some time, even in the best case scenario. We need to get tough to be able to stay alert and stay informed under these challenging conditions because there is hope. If we build resilience, we can come out the other side of this. If you look at the projections on this channel for America's emerging bioregions, you can see that even here, in one of the most stable areas on the planet, the literal landscape will be very different. This recent news about the oceans is worth noting, not as something wholly unexpected, but as part of the change landscape we're all going to be navigating as we move into the future. I think the biggest impacts we'll feel here in America this year in 2023 will be related to emerging impacts on the global supply chain that will persist into 24. With the heat and the drought, Southeast Asia has already been having challenges with electricity production. They can't keep things running in some places because conditions have become so extreme. These systems that I'm talking about, these big global supply systems, there's a lot of awareness that they aren't sustainable, right? This El Nino year, the pressure will become more and more evident. What changes to the supply chain we did not make prudently, and like we haven't been prudent, right? We're going to be pushed to making changes towards sustainability and towards local production, towards what the DoD calls onshoring of the supply chain. If you're all involved in local government or politics, I would suggest becoming more aware of zoning and industrial issues. There are production changes on the horizon that could be positive for smart, resilient communities, or they could be exploitative. You got to be able to shape the future you want, right? Wrapping it up, like many climate stories, let's remember this situation stinks. It's not a big surprise. Us in the US, we're not the primary victims here. We are fortunate. Relatively, in America, we have a great outlook. Staying aware of what's coming can help your community stay on the ball. Let's get ready. Let's not forget, we got community chat coming up on July 2nd. I want to focus in on the oceans, talking a little bit about the impacts that these sizable changes are going to have, particularly on various species and ecosystems. Anyone who wants to join in, I feel like this is a good processing moment for us. I want to thank all of our donors. I want to thank all of our subscribers. I want to thank all of our volunteers who have really made this possible. Thanks for being here with me. We're going to get ready together.